The sky trembles with engines diving like arrows of fate. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to stand beneath a kamikaze's final descent? I am your guide on forgotten history tales, and together we'll step into that firestorm. The first thing I remember is the sound. A high-pitched drone, sharp as a razor drawn across metal, cutting through the heavy sea air. It wasn't the ordinary hum of engines we were used to out on the Pacific. This was something tighter, faster, hungrier. I take you onto the deck of a U.S. Navy carrier in late 1944, when the Empire of Japan unleashed one of the most terrifying weapons of the war. Not a machine, but a man in a machine. The kamikaze. The sky was bruised with smoke. You could taste it. Thick, oily, mixed with the salt spray that rolled over the deck. Men worked the anti-aircraft guns with hands slick from sweat, eyes straining against the glare of the sun. Every second felt stretched, elastic, as if time itself resisted what was about to happen. I can still feel the silence between the bursts of flak, those heartbeats of dread before the next explosion. And then, like a hawk folding its wings for the kill, you'd see it. A plane diving straight for you. No hesitation, no evasive maneuvers, no retreat. By 1944, Japan was cornered. Its empire, once stretching wide across the Pacific, was shrinking. Each island fortress was falling, each naval battle chipping away at its strength. But desperation breeds new weapons, and this one was unlike any we had faced before. The word kamikaze meant divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that once, centuries earlier, had scattered Mongol fleets threatening Japan. Now it meant young men, barely trained pilots, strapped into planes loaded with bombs, hurling themselves at our ships with the force of a storm. Imagine the psychology. The enemy had stopped fighting to survive. He fought to die. For us on deck, that changed everything. A regular dogfight gave you a chance. You could predict maneuvers. You could hope for survival. But a kamikaze, he was locked on like fate itself, and fate cannot be reasoned with. I walk you along the carrier deck now. The heat of the engines rises through your boots. The guns thunder like rolling drums. Look at the men. Some are shouting commands. Some are frozen still, staring skyward, caught between terror and disbelief. There are stories of sailors who swore they could see the pilot's face in those final seconds, eyes wide, determined, almost serene. The Japanese planes weren't always advanced. Many were old Zeros or hastily built wooden craft. But the weapon wasn't in the metal. It was in the will. Each one carried enough explosive to tear through steel, to rip open a destroyer's hull like paper. And when they hit, God, the sound was monstrous. Metal screamed. Fireballs bloomed orange against the sea. The shock waves rattled your bones. One sailor, a gunner's mate, later recalled how he kept firing until the very last breath of a plane's approach. You could see the bullets hitting, the smoke trailing, and still it came, he said. It didn't matter how much you tore it apart. It was already committed. There is something deeply unsettling about watching an enemy who has no exit plan. It strips away your defenses, your rationalizations. War usually feeds on the instinct to survive. Men duck, weave, run, plead with the gods. But this was ritual, sacrifice, theater written in fire. And it played on the human mind like nothing else. The smell of burning aviation fuel is unlike anything else. Sweet, poisonous, clinging to your nostrils long after the flames die. Mixed with the salt air, it created a stench that would haunt us for days. Even when you tried to sleep, the scent curled in the back of your throat, dragging you back to the deck, back to the screaming dive. I confess, There were moments when I wondered what kind of faith, or madness, or desperation could drive a young man to such a choice. On our side, we fought to return home. We counted the days until liberty. But on theirs, homecoming wasn't expected. Homecoming was death. Many of those pilots were no older than 19, drafted into a cult of sacrifice. Diaries recovered after the war revealed thoughts as fragile as any youth's, fears of dishonoring family, hopes for fleeting glory, even small notes about the cherry blossoms they would never see bloom again. They were human, and yet, in the moment of attack, they became something almost mythic, living weapons, embodiments of their nation's last breath. And for us, facing them, the myth bled into the terror. Every dive carried the weight of inevitability. You could shoot them down, yes, and many were. But every so often, one broke through. And when it did, the deck became hell itself. Fire, screams, shrapnel, men thrown like rag dolls into the sea. I remember the silence afterward. Always the silence. When the smoke cleared and the fires were being beaten down, when the wounded were carried below and the dead covered with sheets, the sea suddenly seemed too calm. The waves lapping, indifferent. The sun shining, pitiless. The contrast was unbearable. And yet, I tell you, this was only the beginning. The first strikes were chaotic, shocking, but soon the attacks became coordinated, relentless, waves upon waves of human missiles hurling themselves at our fleet. In that moment on the carrier deck, staring at the horizon where the next speck of death would rise, I realized we had entered a new chapter of the war. The question was no longer whether the kamikaze would come. It was whether we could endure it. Before I take you back to the thunder of guns and the shriek of engines, I want you to follow me far away from the carrier decks, to the quiet courtyards of Japan, where cherry blossoms drifted on the wind like pink snow. It is here, in these moments of delicate beauty, that the young men destined to become kamikaze pilots once walked. Ordinary boys, students, sons. They laughed with friends. They sketched in notebooks. They dreamed of love. And yet, within a few short years, they would be strapped into cockpits with no expectation of return. Picture a 19-year-old student, pen in hand, writing his final letter. His handwriting trembles not from fear, but from the weight of certainty. He knows this is the last ink he will ever put to paper. Outside, the temple bell tolls. Inside, his mother folds the letter with tears she tries to hide. The words are simple. I will die smiling. Please do not grieve too long. I have read such letters, and they stay with me like ghosts. Japan in 1944 was a nation cornered by defeat, yet cloaked in ritual. The government and military high command spoke in tones of destiny, invoking the spirit of the samurai, the divine wind that had saved Japan centuries before. To a culture steeped in honor, shame, and sacrifice, the idea of death for the emperor was not seen as despair. It was offered as transcendence. The pilots who would become kamikaze were gathered from universities, from farms, from families. They were not all zealots. Many were reluctant, even afraid. But the machinery of the state, combined with the iron grip of cultural expectation, left them with little choice. To refuse was dishonor not only for themselves, but for their families. The training was brief, sometimes as short as 30 hours of flight, enough to take off, navigate, and dive. They were not expected to land. Why waste time teaching them? Their purpose was singular, to fuse themselves with their planes and become human bullets. I walk you now into their training fields. Hear the bark of the instructors, the roar of engines coughing on worn-out fuel, the laughter of boys trying to mask their fear. At night, they wrote in journals, tiny reflections of their human selves breaking through the uniformed facade. One young man, barely 20, scribbled, "I do not want to die. But to live while others perish would be unbearable." They were told their deaths would turn the tide of war, that by smashing their lives against steel decks, they would sink ships, shatter morale, defend the homeland. Rituals wrapped their sacrifice in holiness. Before flying, they donned white headbands inscribed with the rising sun, symbols of purity and loyalty. They drank ceremonial cups of sake, as if it were a wedding toast with death itself. Some tucked locks of hair or fingernails into envelopes, keepsakes for mothers and lovers to treasure after the flames consumed them. Psychologists after the war would try to untangle the state of mind that fueled such decisions. Was it fanaticism? Coercion? Brainwashing? The truth lies in a gray space, as it so often does in war. Some truly believed they were divine instruments, others simply obeyed, and some, in their last moments, confessed doubts. But none had the luxury to turn back. Once the canopy shut, their fate was sealed. As I read their letters and diaries, I can feel their duality, the human boy and the sacrificial warrior, locked in one fragile body. They wrote about cherry blossoms, symbols of life's fleeting beauty. They wrote about mothers waiting at the gate. They wrote about fear of shame more than fear of death. That was the hook of the culture, the idea that to live dishonorably was worse than to die young. And yet, behind the slogans, there were cracks. One pilot wrote, "If I could, I would like to live and read books and watch the spring flowers." Another, "I am afraid, but I must hide it, even from myself." These words tear away the myth and show us the truth. They were not gods, not divine winds. They were boys, pressed into the sky with bombs strapped to their bellies. I ask myself, what does it mean to know your life is measured in minutes, to know the horizon is your grave? The human mind tries to make peace with inevitability. Some dressed their terror in poetry. Others clung to the image of their emperor as father. But in the silence before takeoff, as the engine growled and the ground slipped away, I believe they all carried the same private ache, the wish to turn back. The Japanese command wrapped the kamikaze in ancient imagery. They spoke of samurai charging into battle, of warriors who found beauty in a noble death. They resurrected the word kamikaze, a divine wind that had once saved Japan. By placing these boys into that lineage, the military transformed their individual deaths into something eternal, or so they claimed. But myth and reality collided in the sky. For on the other side of that cockpit dive, the myth was steel and blood and fire raining down on American decks. The divine wind was felt not as salvation, but as terror. And in that clash of perceptions, one side seeing ritual honor, the other seeing madness, we glimpse the raw psychology of war. I bring you back now to the carrier deck, where sailors squint against the sun, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, another 19-year-old has just lifted off, his headband tied, his letter left behind, his hands trembling on the controls. His path and ours are set to collide. The next chapter is written not on the ground in training fields, but in the screaming chaos of battle where kamikaze and crew would meet in fire. The alarm bell splits the air like a blade. Klaxons wail, boots thunder on steel decks, and every man knows what's coming. I take you onto the carrier again, into the heat of battle, when the kamikaze did not come as lone predators, but as a storm, coordinated, relentless, wave after wave, turning the sky itself into a weapon. Look up. The sun is half hidden behind smoke, and from that smoke, the enemy emerges, Dozens of planes, small black crosses against the light, wings angled downward like the scythes of reapers. The cry echoes through the ship. Bandits inbound. Prepare for impact. Hearts pound in unison with the drumbeat of anti-aircraft fire. The sea becomes a stage, and death dives from above. By late 1944, the Kamikaze had grown from desperate improvisation into organized terror. The Battle of Leyte Gulf and later Okinawa saw entire squadrons unleashed in suicidal fury. Imagine standing on deck as radar officers called out vectors, each one a warning of men who had already accepted death. The Japanese command called them Tokotai, special attack units. The Allies called them suicide squadrons. Each pilot carried not only explosives, but also the burden of representing a nation's last gamble. For us on the ships, the scale was overwhelming. It was no longer the chance of one rogue attacker slipping through. It was saturation, so many coming at once that our defenses strained to breaking. I walk you through the moment. The guns erupt, 5-inch cannons belching fire, smaller anti-aircraft bursts peppering the sky with black clouds. Tracers streak like fiery threads, sowing the air with desperation. The smell of cordite chokes the throat. The vibration of recoil rattles your chest. One plane spins, hits square in the wing, trailing black smoke before plunging into the sea with a hiss. Cheers erupt, brief and sharp, but the others keep coming. Always more, always closer. You hear the shriek of engines as a Zero dives, sun glinting off its canopy. Men scream coordinates, hands clawing at the guns, sweat blinding their eyes. The plane dips lower, lower, ignoring the fire hammering its fuselage. In those seconds, it feels like the entire world narrows into the shape of that descending aircraft. It is the size of fate itself, growing larger, unstoppable. Impact. A blast so violent, it lifts men off their feet. The deck lurches as though the sea itself has punched the ship. Shards of steel whine through the air. Fire blossoms, hungry and bright, devouring paint, rope, flesh. The cries of the wounded mix with the howl of alarms. The kamikaze has struck, and then another follows, and another. The human mind is not built to withstand constant collision with inevitability. Each wave erodes your nerves. Each dive carves away at courage. Men described feeling as though their souls shrank, retreating somewhere deep inside to survive the unending terror. Others hardened into stone, fighting with a coldness that bordered on numbness. One sailor later recalled, "You prayed to see the fireball in the sky. That meant you'd stopped him. If you didn't, then the fireball was on your ship." Another wrote, "It wasn't the dying that scared me. It was the waiting. Knowing the sky would crack open any second, every dive forced you to look into the face of a man determined to kill himself just to kill you." That knowledge weighed heavier than steel. It planted a seed of dread. If someone has already surrendered his life, how do you defend against him? Japanese propaganda painted these squadrons as invincible storms, their sacrifice destined to break the enemy's back. But reality was chaos. Many planes were shot down before reaching their targets. Many missed entirely, plunging harmlessly into the sea. Yet even a small percentage striking home caused catastrophic damage. A single kamikaze could cripple a destroyer, set a carrier ablaze, or kill hundreds in seconds. The irony was stark. The pilots were wrapped in myth, their deaths painted as noble poetry. But for us, receiving their strike, there was no poetry. Only terror, only screams, only the smell of burning oil and flesh. The myth dissolved in fire. I take you into the wardroom where medics fought to save the burned and the broken. bandages blackened with soot, morphine needles piercing trembling arms, men clutching each other's hands in silent agony. You could hear whispered names of mothers, of wives, of God. One survivor remembered pulling a friend from the flames, his uniform charred, his skin blistering. The man whispered, "Did we stop them?" As though the only measure of survival was whether the next wave would come. And the truth was, yes, we stopped some, but never all. The horizon always held another speck, and that is what gnawed at us. The horizon, always the horizon. You could clear the deck, put out the fires, bury the dead at sea, and still, you would stand at the rail, squinting into that endless blue, waiting for the next scream from the sky. Because the storm was not over. The kamikaze would not only continue, they would evolve, striking in greater numbers, with greater fury, until the sea itself felt cursed. The next chapter is not about a single battle, but about endurance, the long torment of men who lived day after day under the shadow of a sky that could turn against them at any moment. The horizon off Okinawa looked endless, but for the men who fought there, it felt like a cage. I take you now into the spring of 1945, when the largest kamikaze campaign of the war descended upon the American fleet. For nearly 3 months, day and night, wave after wave, the sky itself seemed determined to crush us. It begins again at dawn. The first orange light touches the sea, and the watchmen cry out, enemy aircraft inbound. Men sprint to battle stations, hands raw from days of gripping hot steel. By the time the sun rises fully, the battle is already raging. Flak clouds bloom black against the sky like diseased flowers, and the cries of incoming never seem to stop. Each day bleeds into the next, a nightmare without end. Okinawa was supposed to be the final stepping stone to Japan's homeland. The U.S. fleet gathered was immense: carriers, battleships, destroyers, an armada unmatched in history. But Japan threw everything it had left into stopping us. More than 1,500 kamikaze planes were launched during the campaign. Never before had the suicide attacks been so relentless, so organized, so devastating. For sailors, Okinawa became a crucible. Imagine standing on a deck for weeks on end, eyes straining at the horizon, ears ringing from gunfire, nerves frayed to breaking. Sleep came in scraps, food was swallowed in haste, and fear became a constant companion. I walk you through a typical day. At 0600, the klaxons sound, planes approach, guns roar until your ears buzz with a permanent hum. Some attackers fall in smoke and flame before reaching the fleet. Others break through. A destroyer erupts in fire as a kamikaze smashes into its bridge, the explosion echoing across the sea. The cries of the wounded rise as medics scramble. Fires are beaten down with seawater hoses. Dead are carried below, their bodies wrapped for burial. And before the smoke clears, another wave comes. Midday, afternoon, evening, always more, always closer. At night, there is no peace. Radar screens glow with signals, bogies approaching under the cover of darkness. The men stand ready in the blackness, nerves taut. Some planes dive with engines off, ghost-like, trying to strike silently. The sea flickers with tracers and searchlights, a nightmare painted in red and white. This was the true weapon of the kamikaze, not just the fire and steel, but the erosion of the human spirit. You could not rest. You could not breathe. Even when no planes were in sight, your body remained coiled, waiting for the next dive. Men began to crack. Some grew reckless, laughing at danger as if daring fate to take them. Others retreated into silence, staring blankly at the deck even when shells exploded nearby. One officer recalled that after weeks of attacks, we were like ghosts ourselves, walking, firing, eating, but with souls numb from too much death. The psychological weight was crushing. Unlike conventional battles, where an enemy retreated or surrendered, the kamikaze never stopped. Each attack was absolute, each pilot committed to death. It stripped away hope for reprieve. The numbers are staggering. More than 30 American ships were sunk by kamikaze strikes during Okinawa. Hundreds more were damaged. Some left smoldering wrecks barely afloat. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed, thousands more wounded. The ocean itself seemed littered with fire and wreckage. But beyond numbers, it was the faces that haunted you. The cook scalded by boiling oil when the galley was struck. The signalman blinded by shrapnel. The friend who shared cigarettes with you at dawn and was gone by noon, his body buried at sea beneath the waves. Each loss carved deeper into the collective spirit. For the Japanese, Okinawa was framed as the ultimate sacrifice. Kamikaze pilots were exalted in propaganda as guardians of the homeland, even as their deaths brought only brief delays. For us, the myth was stripped bare by the sheer attrition of it. We no longer saw them as noble warriors. We saw them as endless death, faceless yet personal, an enemy who offered no quarter and asked none. And yet, in strange moments of reflection, sailors admitted to feeling pity. Watching a burning plane spiral into the sea, some thought of the boy inside, consumed by fire. "I hated him for trying to kill us," one sailor wrote. "But I pitied him too, for being sent to die that way." Even in the darkest stretches, humanity clung on. Men shared whispered jokes between raids, as if laughter could defy fate. Chaplains walked the decks, offering prayers, their voices steady even as shells thundered. And when a ship was struck, others rushed to rescue survivors from the flames or the water, defying their own fear to save comrades. One survivor recalled standing in a lifeboat, watching his destroyer sink after a kamikaze strike. "The sea was red," he said, "and yet, as we floated, another ship came for us." That was the only hope we had, that no matter how many times they hit us, we would not face it alone. But Okinawa was not only a battlefield of steel and fire, it was also the place where questions began to rise. Questions about the nature of sacrifice, about the breaking point of human endurance, about how far a nation would go to avoid defeat. Because even as the kamikaze rained down, another weapon was being prepared, one that would end the war in a way no one could have imagined. The next chapter is not just about the sailors or the pilots. It is about the shadow looming over both, the coming of the atomic age. The sky above Okinawa still burns in my memory, smoke, fire, and the shriek of planes falling like spears. But even as we endured the storm of kamikaze assaults, a darker shadow stretched across the horizon of history. I take you now into those final months of the Pacific War, when two forces collided: the relentless human sacrifice of the kamikaze, and the dawning of a weapon so destructive it would redefine the meaning of war itself. Picture the deck at dusk. Fires smolder from the day's battles. The sea glows red with sunset and blood, and the men whisper rumors of something terrible, something secret, being prepared back home. At the same time, across the sea, young kamikaze pilots are drinking their final cups of sake, tying on headbands, preparing to hurl themselves into steel. One side clings to sacrifice, the other to science. Both are racing toward the end. By mid-1945, Japan's position was dire. Its navy shattered, its air force crippled, its cities already firebombed to ruins. And yet, the kamikaze kept coming. To American sailors, it felt like the enemy was pouring the last of its soul into these attacks. To the Japanese command, each death was a delaying tactic, a hope to bleed the Americans so heavily that they might negotiate peace instead of demanding surrender. But far away, in the deserts of New Mexico, another force was being tested, the atomic bomb. Few of us at sea knew the details then. What we knew was rumor, that scientists were creating a weapon that could flatten entire cities. While we fought off planes diving at our throats, the world itself was shifting under our feet. I walk you back onto the carrier deck during those final weeks of Okinawa. The raids continued, kamikaze squadrons appearing like phantoms day after day. We braced for impact, guns roaring, ships burning, lives lost. And yet, beneath it all, there was a gnawing awareness. No matter how many we shot down, the attacks never truly ended. It was attrition of the soul. You could feel it in the way men spoke less, in the hollow stares after another friend was carried below deck, in the silence that followed each burial at sea. It was as though we were caught in a loop, fighting the same battle every day without escape. But then came whispers from command. A new weapon was nearly ready, a weapon that would end the war in a single stroke. For us, those whispers were surreal. How could anything compare to the chaos we faced daily? What weapon could eclipse the terror of a kamikaze hurtling toward you at 500 miles per hour? Looking back, I see now that both sides were bound by inevitability. The kamikaze pilot strapped himself into inevitability. His life ended the moment he took off. We, too, felt inevitability pressing down on us, the certainty that the war could not continue like this, that something would break. The only question was how, and that question gnawed at the soul. Could an entire nation be crushed by sacrifice alone? Could another nation unleash a weapon so monstrous it would end all need for sacrifice? We were pawns in that clash, standing on steel decks, while history's tide shifted around us. By the summer, even Japanese propaganda began to ring hollow. The kamikaze did not stop the American advance. They inflicted terror, yes, and heavy casualties, but the fleet pressed on. Okinawa fell. And yet the kamikaze squadrons still launched. Boys still strapped themselves to bombs, still hurled their youth into the sea. To the men on our ships, it felt like watching a nation commit slow suicide. What had once seemed like a terrifying myth, the divine wind, now looked like tragic futility. We no longer saw gods in those cockpits. We saw wasted suns, consumed by fire for a cause already lost. Even as whispers of the atomic weapon spread, life on deck remained consumed by fire and steel. I remember a night when two kamikazes struck in quick succession, one smashing into a destroyer's bow, the other diving into an escort carrier. The flames lit up the sea so brightly that men said it looked like dawn had come twice. And in those fires, men died screaming, while others clawed their way out of smoke-filled compartments. Yet the very next morning, rumors again. It's almost ready. The big one. Some men clung to the idea of salvation through this new weapon. Others shuddered at the thought. What kind of device could make the kamikaze seem small by comparison? The kamikaze had been cloaked in myth, their sacrifice woven into the spiritual fabric of Japan. But the atomic bomb, this was no myth. This was science, unbound, humanity's intellect twisted into annihilation. In the coming months, those two forces would collide, boys diving with ancient swords strapped to their cockpits and a bomb that could vaporize cities in a flash. One side fought with ritual and blood. the other with calculation and fire beyond imagining, and the world would never be the same. I bring you back to the horizon now. Another kamikaze squadron approaches, sunlight glinting off their wings. The guns rise, the men brace, the cycle begins again. But behind it all, another sun is preparing to rise, a sun that will not burn above the sea, but consume entire cities. The next chapter is about that collision, the final months when kamikaze still dove from the sky, even as Hiroshima and Nagasaki awaited their fate. The sea was still churning with smoke and flame when the end began to reveal itself. I take you now into the summer of 1945, the last, most desperate days of Japan's kamikaze campaign, when young men still launched themselves into the sky, even as a new kind of fire prepared to descend upon their homeland. It is August, and the decks are slick with oil and sweat. Another kamikaze has just been shot down, plunging into the sea in a hiss of steam. Sailors cheer, but the sound feels hollow. They know another will follow. And yet, in the distance, whispers ripple through the fleet. Something extraordinary has happened. A single bomb has destroyed an entire city. Hiroshima. The voices falter. How can this be true? How can one weapon do what thousands of kamikaze pilots could not? By this time, the kamikaze had become both familiar and unbearable. They no longer shocked us with novelty. They crushed us with repetition. The attacks came in fewer numbers than at Okinawa, but each one still had the power to maim, to kill, to ignite the sky. Japan, even as its cities burned from conventional firebombing, continued to summon boys into cockpits. The rhetoric of sacrifice had not faded. If anything, it intensified. Government broadcasts urged citizens to prepare for mass suicide attacks should the Allies invade the mainland. Women trained with bamboo spears, children dug trenches, while young men were taught to crash planes, boats, even gliders into enemy forces. But then came Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The atomic bomb shattered the myth of noble sacrifice by replacing it with raw annihilation. I walk you into that moment of realization. On the carrier deck, men gather around radios, listening to fragmentary reports. "The city is gone," a voice says. "Not damaged, not bombed, gone." Sailors stare at each other in disbelief. How could an entire city vanish in a single flash? And yet, even as that reality seeped in, kamikaze planes still came. In those final days, some pilots lifted off knowing their homeland had been scorched by a weapon beyond comprehension. Still, they flew. Still, they dove. Their sacrifice now collided with a truth they could not escape. No amount of ritual, no number of dives could stand against this new force. Imagine being a sailor then, facing the old terror from the sky while knowing something far greater loomed beyond the horizon. You fired at the incoming planes, you buried your comrades, and you wondered, had the war already shifted beneath your feet? The contrast was haunting. For years, the kamikaze embodied the extremity of human sacrifice, men surrendering life to take others with them. We feared them, we cursed them, we pitied them. But the atomic bomb was different. It asked nothing of its wielder except the pressing of a button. No ritual, no poetry, just science, cold and unstoppable. One sailor later wrote, "I had spent months terrified of a boy diving out of the sun. Then I realized one weapon could erase that boy's entire city. I did not know whether to feel relief or horror. That is the paradox of those final days. The kamikaze taught us the depth of human devotion, twisted into a weapon. The atomic bomb taught us the depth of human intellect, twisted into annihilation. Both redefined what war could mean. When news of Nagasaki followed Hiroshima, The truth could no longer be denied. Japan's leaders faced the impossible: continue demanding sacrifice or accept surrender. For the kamikaze pilots still alive, the blow was existential. Some had written their final letters, tied their headbands, prepared for the ritual. And then, suddenly, there was no stage for their death. The war had ended before their sacrifice could be made. Some survivors spoke later of relief, others of shame. "I had prepared to die," one former pilot admitted years later, "and when the order never came, I felt like a ghost who had been denied his fate." For the American sailors, the end was equally complex. Relief surged through the fleet. We had survived the storm, survived the fire from the sky, but mingled with that relief was unease. The world had ended, not with the final kamikaze crash, but with a blinding flash over two cities none of us had ever seen. I bring you back to the deck of a destroyer the day after Nagasaki. The men are quiet, almost reverent. No cheers, no songs, just silence as they stare across the sea, wondering what it all meant. Some write letters home about survival, others about horror. One sailor writes, "We faced boys who gave everything, and we answered with a bomb that took everything. I don't know which is worse." Meanwhile, in Japan, mothers wept over sons who had died in vain, while others wept with relief that their sons had been spared by surrender. The myth of the kamikaze, once wrapped in divine wind, now dissolved in the radioactive ash of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, the war ended. But the memory did not. For those who faced the kamikaze, the sound of engines diving out of the sun would never fade. For those who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the memory of one flash would haunt forever. The next chapter is not about battle, but about memory. How these experiences scarred the men who lived them, how nations remembered or forgot, and how the myth of the kamikaze still lingers in the shadows of history. The guns have fallen silent. The engines no longer roar. The horizon is empty, the sea deceptively calm. And yet, for those who lived through the kamikaze storm, the war did not end when Japan surrendered. I take you now into the aftermath, when the ghosts of those attacks followed men across oceans and decades. It is 1946. A sailor sits in his small hometown diner, coffee cooling in front of him. The jukebox plays a cheerful tune. Laughter rises from a booth nearby, but he doesn't hear any of it. In his mind, he still hears the drone of engines diving from the sun, still sees the fireball rising from the deck. He blinks, and the world is smoke again. That is what it was like, bringing the war home, carrying it inside your skull, long after the battles had ended. For American veterans, the kamikaze campaign was more than an episode of war. It was a wound that never fully healed. Unlike dogfights or naval gun battles, these attacks had no rhythm of victory and retreat. They came like storms, chaotic, unrelenting, dehumanizing. Many survivors spoke later of a specific kind of dread: the waiting, the inevitability, the knowledge that a human being was already committed to your destruction. Back home, the nation celebrated victory. Parades filled the streets, flags waved, bands played. But for the sailors who had stood on burning decks, there was no easy celebration. The image of planes diving into steel, the screams of comrades, the smell of burning fuel, these became permanent companions. What we now call post-traumatic stress was then just silence, withdrawal, sleepless nights. I walk you into those veterans' memories. Some could never again stand the sound of an airplane engine overhead. It sent them straight back to the Pacific. Others avoided crowds, always scanning the horizon as though danger still lurked. Some drowned their ghosts in drink, others in work. A few wrote memoirs, trying to capture in words what the rest of the world could never understand. One sailor wrote decades later, "The kamikaze took more than lives. They took our peace. Even in victory, we never escaped their dives." But the aftermath was not only American. In Japan, the legacy of the kamikaze was tangled in grief and shame. Families received letters, locks of hair, photographs of sons who had been consumed by fire. Some mothers wept openly. Others placed portraits on altars and bowed in silence each morning, as though still greeting the dead. For Japan, the myth of the kamikaze began to crumble in the peace that followed. At first, the state presented them as heroes, martyrs who had defended the homeland with sacred sacrifice. Monuments were built, ceremonies held. But as years passed, the narrative shifted. Survivors of the war began to speak of manipulation, of young men coerced into death, of commanders who praised sacrifice while avoiding it themselves. The kamikaze became a mirror for Japan's own reckoning. Were they noble heroes? Or victims of a militaristic system that exploited youth and faith? The answer, perhaps, is both. And in that paradox, Japan struggled to find meaning. One former kamikaze pilot, who survived only because Japan surrendered before his mission, later confessed, "I wanted to live. I never believed I was divine, but I could not say it then. To say it was to shame my family. So I prepared to die." His voice trembled with both relief and regret, as though he still carried guilt for surviving. On the American side, some veterans spoke of pity that came too late. In the heat of battle, they cursed the pilots as fanatics. But in peace, they wondered about the boys inside those planes. One veteran wrote in his old age, "We were terrified of them, but they were terrified too." We were all young men caught in the machinery of death. The kamikaze lingered in global memory as symbols of fanaticism, of sacrifice, of war's madness. Films portrayed them as demons of the sky, diving without fear. History books debated their effectiveness, their psychology, their place in the war. But for those who lived it, myth was secondary. Memory was raw, personal, unshakable. The myth was divine wind. The memory was smoke and blood. And yet, even in that darkness, there were strange attempts at reconciliation. Decades later, American veterans visited Japan, standing at memorials built for the kamikaze dead. Some wept, some prayed, some shook hands with the families of their former enemies. The human need to find meaning outlived the war itself. And so, the kamikaze became not only history, but legacy. A story retold in books, in ceremonies, in the nightmares of veterans, in the silent grief of mothers. The divine wind blew once more, not as a storm of steel, but as memory carried across generations. But memory changes with time, and in the decades after the war, the world began to reinterpret what the kamikaze meant, not just as a tactic, but as a warning. The next chapter is about that legacy, how the kamikaze shaped military thought, cultural memory, and the enduring question of what drives human beings to sacrifice everything in war. The waves roll endlessly across the Pacific, the same waters that once burned with fire and oil, the same horizon where boys dived to their deaths. I take you now to the end of our journey, not to the decks of carriers or the cockpits of Zeros, but to the decades that followed, to the legacy of the kamikaze, a legacy that still lingers like a ghost in the winds of history. Imagine standing at a memorial in Japan, a granite slab carved with names of boys who never came home. Beside it, an American veteran places a flower, his hands trembling not with anger, but with memory. Two nations, once locked in fire, now bound by shared ghosts. That is the legacy of the kamikaze, not only destruction, but remembrance, warning, and haunting. After the war, the world struggled to make sense of what the kamikaze represented. For America and its allies, they became symbols of fanaticism, proof of how far a nation might go when cornered. The image of a plane diving from the sun, engines screaming, burned into military strategy as a lesson. Never underestimate the power of desperation. For Japan, the legacy was more complicated. The state had framed the kamikaze as heroes, divine protectors of the homeland. But in peace, that story fractured. Families asked why their sons had been sent to certain death. Survivors asked why their lives had been demanded as fuel for a war already lost. The kamikaze became a national wound, remembered with pride by some, with shame by others, with grief by all. I walk you through how that legacy spread. In military academies, the kamikaze were studied as case studies in asymmetrical warfare. How a weaker power, unable to match industrial might, turned to sacrifice as a weapon. Modern strategists noted how the principle echoed in later conflicts: suicide bombers, insurgencies, terror attacks. The kamikaze were not just a moment in history, they were a blueprint that others would follow. In culture, the kamikaze became myth and metaphor. Films, novels, and songs cast them as tragic heroes or blind fanatics. Cherry blossoms, once symbols of life's fleeting beauty, became linked with young pilots who fell too soon. In the West, kamikaze entered language itself, a word for reckless abandon, for desperate gambits. But beneath these abstractions lay the human truth. Boys who wanted to live, sailors who wanted to survive, families broken by sacrifice. That truth resists simplification. The legacy of the kamikaze forces us to ask, what drives human beings to give their lives so willingly? Was it faith? Fear? Coercion? Love of country? Fear of shame? The answer is not one thing, but many. And in that complexity, we see the power and the peril of human conviction. For the men who faced the attacks, the legacy was memory etched in their bones. They carried it home, carried it into silence, carried it into their children's lives. For the pilots who never returned, the legacy lived in photographs on altars, in letters yellowed with age, in tears of mothers who never stopped bowing before dawn. The divine wind, once imagined as a typhoon sent by the gods, became instead a storm of memory, circling, never gone. Decades later, American veterans returned to Japan, visiting sites where their enemies had trained. Some met with families of kamikaze pilots. There were tears, handshakes, sometimes embraces. The mothers who had once sent sons to die now sat across from the men who had faced those sons in battle. What words can exist in such moments? Often, none. Only silence, only shared humanity, only the knowledge that war had taken too much from both. In Japan, some former pilots who survived, men who had been scheduled to die but were spared by surrender, struggled with guilt their entire lives. They spoke of feeling half dead, as though fate had robbed them of purpose. And yet, many later came to see survival as another form of duty, to remember, to warn, to speak truth about what sacrifice had cost. Even today, the kamikaze are invoked as metaphors. Military planners cite them when discussing asymmetry, terrorism, extremism. Writers evoke them when describing devotion, futility, or reckless courage. Their image remains potent because it touches something deep in human psychology, the fear of an enemy who does not fear death. But perhaps the deeper legacy is caution. The kamikaze remind us how easily myth can consume the young, how culture can turn boys into weapons, how desperation can twist humanity into fire. And so I leave you here, on the quiet shore of memory. The war is long over. The ships are rusted relics. The pilots are gone, their letters fading with time. But the divine wind still blows, not in storms of steel, but in whispers of history, in lessons unheeded, in the fragile line between honor and tragedy. I take you back to the deck one last time. The horizon is calm now, the sea a mirror. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The faint drone of an engine, the cry of warning, the thunder of impact. The ghosts of the kamikaze do not leave. They circle forever, reminding us what it was like to face a storm made of men.